I'm going to record this meeting, and the good news I would like to give to everybody who's here is that we have actually raised €800 from donations to the Lemon Tree Trust, which was Noel's instigation. He said in lieu of fiat, we would, that was a good introduction to us. So, a huge thank you to everybody who put the money in, and some of you very generously. And thank you to Noel for introducing us to the Lemon Tree Trust. In fact, this year, the MGS Central has decided that we will also use our annual donation to go to Lemon Tree Trust. So altogether, it will be quite a nice donation. Anyway, so now, Noel, are you going to share your screen straight away?
I will, not straight away. I'll just introduce myself first. Yeah.
Well done. Yeah.
Okay. Well, good evening, everybody. Or in some cases, good morning. Thank you very much for having me. As Angela was saying, I do feel rather diffident about doing this because I've only been living in the Mediterranean for 2 years, and I've never been one particularly for Mediterranean holidays. But I do have a whole sort of lifetime of experience of really applying the lessons of plant ecology science, to some extent plant physiology, to garden and landscape designed plantings. I have a whole way of unpacking and looking systematically at plants and their relationship to habitat and climate, which I hope will be useful. I've been able to utilize some of this in some teaching here in Portugal, and relating to the very welcoming garden and landscape community here. So I've been on a really, really steep learning curve, and I'm hoping that this learning curve may be of benefit to you. Now, I am primarily known as a writer on plants and gardens, as Angela said, in the sort of North European cool temperate zone. I've worked with a Dutch designer, Piet Oudolf, who is now, his main project is actually a garden in Menorca. He's having to rely very much on the experience of others to select plants for that. Anyway, I will go over to my screen.
Okay, me too. I'm going to there you go.
And that's all working nicely. I'm just going to minimize sorry, it's been moving things around here. As Angela said, I'm asking for donations to the Lemon Tree Trust, who are a wonderful charity who basically funnel money towards creating gardens, mostly vegetable gardens, in refugee camps around the world. And they're doing some really wonderful work. So I'm, in lieu of a fee, I'm asking that you kindly donate to Lemon Tree Trust. And also another condition was that at the end of this, I will do a brief promotion of my business, Garden Masterclass. So the better photography of this presentation is by Claire Takash, who is an Australian garden photographer, really very, very good. And it's been a great privilege over the last couple of years to have been working with Claire on a book for Phaidon, which is coming out in March. And I believe the title is Wild, with a very long subtitle. Basically, it's a documentation of naturalistic planting. And we've got a number of Mediterranean zone projects in that. So thank you very much to Claire for as I said, if it's a really good picture, it's by Claire. So I'm going to start off really unpacking my understanding of the kind of gardening decisions we need to make in Mediterranean climates. And I'm going to be ending up with looking at some of the gardens that I personally have found very inspirational. Now, this was the sort of classic Mediterranean garden. It's a little park built around a memorial to the First World War, just outside a flat I rented in central Portugal, and we looked out at this every day. It's that sculptural approach to planting, which has very much typified the classic Mediterranean garden style. Of course, it's made up of that was made up of privet. Box is very much the favoured material, and certainly in the cooler regions.
Sorry, Noel, I'm seeing, actually, I think I'm looking at another garden, a different garden, not a formal garden. Sorry. Okay.
Oh, have we?
There we are. Yes, this I
Okay.
think is correct. Yeah, there. Yeah, that's a sculptural garden. Okay. Sorry.
Okay. Yes. So, of course, the raw material for this is, for many of these, is box. And box is typical of these evergreen shrubs that if you just leave it, it looks like this, relatively untidy. And it has been the clipping of these more amorphous shrubs that has absolutely dominated the approach to gardening in the Mediterranean region, and which in a way is in the way of the sort of dialectic of design, is what an awful lot of people are now reacting against. People are also reacting against this, the endless trailing of plastic piping across projects. This actually is a landscape around a service station on the motorway between Porto and Lisbon. And I've got a feeling it might have been designed by a friend of mine, who one of her sort of less inspired jobs for a landscape company. Whether all of this irrigation is necessary is one question. And another question is whether it will ever be used properly. And this kind of mass mindless irrigation and extension of wasting of resources in terms of the plastic, the water.
Sorry, Noel, I have to interrupt you. The view isn't changing for...
No, I am a screen share, but when I go to play, it stops sharing.
So okay, can you do manual? Is that going to work?
I'll do manual, yes. I mean, this is a problem that we have occasionally had. So I will just enlarge the screen, and we'll have to...
The image is good now. I mean, you can see what you're talking about, and it's just better than having you talking about something.
You're going to have to do this, I don't know why this happens, actually, but anyway, there we are. So to look at this fundamental question of growth in the Mediterranean region, the sensible thing really to think of the gardening year as beginning in September, October, when the weather cools and you have the first rains. What defines our climate is basically water availability in the winter, in the cooler months, and dry summers. So that in a way is lesson number one, really, to think about the gardening season starting now. So flowering is, you get a bit in the autumn and winter, basically, of course, spring and early summer when you have that great crescendo, which is then, of course, cut short by summer drought. In contrast to temperate region growth, where growth is restricted to the warmer months when there is usually enough water availability. And of course, a very different distribution of flowering. Of course, irrigation, you can have water all through the year. But you can also have these evergreens all through the year. And of course, it is no surprise that it is evergreens that have been formed the basic vocabulary of Mediterranean gardens historically. And in a way, this is in many ways a completely rational historical choice. The downside, of course, is that there is a very static quality to these clipped evergreen gardens, which is something that perhaps didn't necessarily bother previous generations, but is one that very much more bothers a current generation, partly because our aesthetics have turned against this, but also the sheer cost of maintaining clipped evergreens on any kind of scale and having it done well. Now, of course, the Mediterranean has an incredibly rich flora, much of which is composed of evergreen subshrubs. So one immediate question is, these look pretty good all through the year. A lot of them have, pretty attractive foliage. Why aren't we growing these? Flowering season is often relatively restricted, but, they do have good foliage. So I'm going to look a little bit at different plant forms and different garden forms derived from those plants through the year in relationship to water availability, which the sun symbol represents midsummer, and the blue bar down the bottom represents water availability. Bulbs, of course, many are of Mediterranean origin. Bulbs do fantastically well in the Mediterranean. The longer your kind of winter turning into spring period, the probably the better you will do. But bulbs are certainly a kind of a very easy option. Woodland flora. Perennial woodland flora, characteristic of much of the Mediterranean and Eurasian region, also does pretty well. This is a flora that is largely adapted to growing in spring and dying back in the summer, partly because of reduced light, but also the pressure of tree roots pulling out moisture and nutrients from the soil also means that a lot of these species can be or are summer dormant, and so we can do really quite interesting things in spring and early summer with this woodland flora. Well, winter annuals, of course, perform well. This is mostly Lunaria rediviva, which is a classic Mediterranean annual, growing essentially through the winter after an autumn germination to flower in spring and then dying. Meadows have become a very popular garden and landscape format, and arguably in parts of the Mediterranean they have a use too. Now, the classic Eurasian meadow flora is defined by a midsummer cut, originally an anthropogenic agricultural method of hay production, cut followed by regrowth. Well, of course, in a Mediterranean climate, you're not going to get that regrowth. You're just going to have bare ground until it rains again in the autumn. Nevertheless, there are many situations where this may be satisfactory. You have something rather lovely in spring and early summer, and then bare ground again until the autumn. There are some situations where that is okay. The meadow concept it tends to segue into the concept of the prairie. I mean, the prairie really is a meadow in some ways, is like a meadow that's kind of a lot bigger and, of course, American, and for the most part doesn't receive any kind of midsummer cut. The use of prairie floras has become very popular in parts of Northern and Central Europe, really because you have an incredible plant diversity that does very well on fertile soils, much more so than is offered by a European flora for those kind of mesic fertile soils. This actually is the prairie is enormously varied. Some of the most interesting types are dry prairie. This is charmingly named Shoe Factory Road prairie, which is on the way to O'Hare Airport in Chicago, and it's very much a fairly short prairie on a sand moraine. Prairie as a concept has been widely copied. This, would you believe, is near St Andrews in Scotland, an extremely successful example of a kind of mock prairie, which is chosen for its relatively low maintenance and its support for late season pollinators. So looking at the feasibility of prairie and East Asian woodland edge flora, which is both of these are essentially from climates where there is high summer rainfall. Without that high summer rainfall, there's no doubt that many of these prairie perennials and some of the East Asian woodland flora do more than survive. Some do very well indeed, if they are well established. And for people on deep soils in river valleys in the Mediterranean region, these may well be very viable options. These plants typically have deep roots, which will enable them to access moisture through the summer. Realistically, though, in the Mediterranean region, we've got four basic options: irrigation, the traditional evergreens, succulents, or the native Mediterranean flora. And I'm using the Portuguese word here. So plants are dependent on resources, key resources, light, water, and nutrients. Our problem, of course, our limiting factor is water. Irrigation has been very often the option, but we're increasingly aware of water shortages, the increased maintenance that very often results from weed growth and indeed overgrowth of desired plants in irrigated situations. Irrigation, but at least irrigation does allow you to have material flowering through that summer period. And indeed, as I just mentioned, you can get away with quite a bit on the deeper alluvial soils. Traditional evergreens, a good mainstay, but we are increasingly turning against them. Succulents. These, of course, are an obvious solution. However, not everyone likes them. They are very alien, which if you are in a heritage environment is a particular issue. Most of them are also completely hopeless for local biodiversity. So why aren't we using more of the local vegetation? It's entirely culturally appropriate. It supports local biodiversity. There's a fair bit of seasonal variation. However, this kind of vegetation tends not to be valued by the public. Cultural attitudes towards natural vegetation vary a lot across Europe. East Europeans, Scandinavians, German-speaking Europe is very, very positive about wild vegetation. Southern European populations tend to be much less so. And this is public acceptance is obviously an issue. Also, to manage it, we do need a whole new set it effectively does need a new set of skills. A massive disadvantage is that many of the most desirable and useful species are relatively short-lived. Many of these also work best in stressful environmental conditions. So if you're working on a shallow soil or a post-industrial site or somewhere with poor quality soil, ironically, you may be in a better position to grow many of these native Mediterranean plants better than if you're on so-called nice soil. And finally, of course, many are inflammable, in some cases very inflammable. So they at least have the advantage that they are relatively maintenance free and will be free of a lot of the maintenance tasks you have with irrigated vegetation, for example, weeds. So we've got various, looking at our sort of chart through the year, this summer gap, which is inevitably the problem. Now, I would suggest that we need some cultural reframing here, that if we look at the summer as a dormant season, then in a way, we can accept we've got 3/4 of the year as potentially some sort of growing season. The problem, though, is that summer is holiday time, and people on holiday want green lawns and pretty flowers, and loads of visitors come, and so therefore there's this strong psychological and cultural pressure towards irrigation through the summer. So really, I would say the central problem of Mediterranean gardening is not actually a cultural or environmental one. It is actually a human cultural one. And whether we always want to rely on those faithful old traditional evergreens to fill the gap in this time is perhaps questionable. We could, of course, rely on the local flora. So looking at what happens to water and nutrient availability with irrigation, obviously we have plenty. However, with watering conventional shrubs and perennials, fine, that's why we irrigate. Once you start irrigating drought-adapted species, however, very often you run into problems, premature decline. There may be several years of manic growth followed by sudden death. fungal diseases. Essentially, you do have to make a choice between whether you're trying to maintain a flora that doesn't really naturally grow there with irrigation, or if you are going for the local flora, you are going to have to cut the irrigation. It is very often, not always, but very often difficult to mix and match. I think that's one very early lesson for anyone in the region. Annuals, of course, are one of the great joys of the Mediterranean, growing through the winter and flowering in spring and early summer. This time of year now, in many of our gardens, we have this kind of insane growth of thousands upon thousands of little annual seedlings. And typical Portuguese roadside in May. Every now and again, there's a particularly good season. This is 3 years ago, I think, around Madrid, after a very long, wet winter and lots of snow. The wildflowers around Madrid were just insane. And everyone is saying these are the best wildflowers anyone can ever remember. And some of them indeed almost looked like they were one of these carefully crafted annual seed mixes. But this is just odd bits of waste ground. It really was a fabulous year. But of course, even at their best, the annuals really give you maybe 2 months. These annuals, of course, have been a great inspiration for hardy annual mixes. This is in Sheffield, one of the hardy annual mixes developed by Nigel Dunnett at Sheffield University, very largely using Mediterranean species. Of course, in the British climate, North European climate, these will continue to flower for a very much longer period. With irrigation, with nutrient availability, many of these, in fact, will keep on going. So again, if you're in one of these sort of more river valley situations, you can certainly keep these going through the summer, perhaps. Turning now to looking at the shrubs that are the bulk of the flora in the Mediterranean, their patterns of growth. I did mention that a lot of them are short-lived. And I think it's very important that we do recognize some basic morphology. A typical shrub of more temperate zone gardens is a very long-lived plant that is continually regenerating from the base. If you look at the base of most shrubs, and here we have a nice Mediterranean example, you see this multiplicity of shoots coming out at the base of varying ages, with a very high capacity for regeneration, both from the base and from lower down the shoots. We see this here on a bay tree, young shoots of varying ages and fresh new growth. And in some cases, a suckering habit. There's a number of Mediterranean shrubs which you can basically hard prune. You can hack right back to the base and they come back up again. These are incredibly useful. And it is completely beyond my understanding as to why Pistacia lentiscus has not been used more in Mediterranean zone gardens. It's an incredibly attractive plant, and it has the enormous virtue of taking hard pruning well. Many of the very weakly woody, very popular salvias from South America, mostly Mexico, also seem to do pretty well. Again, these do seem to be long-lived plants with that capacity for continual regeneration from the base. So again, you can hack this down to the ground and it'll come back again, which is just as well, because a lot of them do get horribly leggy. A version of this is the lignotuber, which is an adaptation primarily for very fire-prone habitats, where there's a great big sort of storage organ underground and a very high capacity for continual regeneration. Quercus coccifera in the Mediterranean region is a very good example of this. The strawberry tree, Medrañero, in Portugal, after the fires of October 2017, the year after, it's extraordinary to see the number of these plants regenerating, able to grow 1.5 meters, even 2 meters from their lignotuber after the fire. However, the bulk of the Mediterranean flora, or at least a lot of the things that we really like, are subshrubs. They're short-lived, there's no capacity for basal regeneration, all the new growth is on the outer part of the plant. Over time, this is what happens. They get leggy and unattractive, and if you hard prune that back, you're effectively killing the plant. Other short-lived shrubs, thinking particularly of the many Fabaceae species, may have a somewhat different habit, but again, all the growth is on the outer part of the plant, and that for the most part, these brooms are short-lived, they're early succession species, and their capacity for longer-term use in gardens is pretty limited. They also have very weak root systems. Once they fall over, that's it. There's been a strong tendency to rely on a lot of these, which does mean that over time, original plantings will lose their shape. This is a very popular Australian shrub, Westringia fruticosa, that I think illustrates this particularly well. Go around to the side of this, and you've got all this woody growth that is essentially forming the core of the plant, and in no way can be pruned back. So, in other words, we've got a spectrum of longevity. At the one end, these absolutely go on forever, survive anything, lignotubers, across to those that really have minimal regeneration from the base. And I would suggest that this is actually a very useful paradigm to be looking at the woody plants that we grow. And I would make a parallel with herbaceous plants, where you have a whole gradient from extremely rigorously spreading rhizomatous species through clump formers across to non-clonal species, many of which are in fact relatively short-lived. Moving on to natural habitats in the Mediterranean region, there is one of those extraordinary rolls of the dice of geological history, in that our limestone floras are very, very diverse. Our acidic floras are extremely boring. I unfortunately live in northern Portugal, where our local granite flora is extremely limited. If I drive down the road to Coimbra and step onto the limestone around there, I'm onto a flora which is literally 10 times more exciting, more diverse. And it's these limestone floras that in the Mediterranean region have been the real inspiration for garden design, because they are so diverse, they're so colourful, it's an enormous range of plant texture and form. So looking at the cycle of succession in the Mediterranean, clearance of land by fire or cutting, you have a grassy habitat that's then replaced by garrigue, which then gets progressively taller through the maquis stage, if we're sticking to French, ending up with a young forest, which naturally would be first pine and then essentially oak. And of course, many of the plants we want to grow in gardens belong to those early garrigue or maquis phases. They are short-lived because eventually they will be replaced by taller plants. They will be outcompeted, and they will only survive long-term through seed or occasionally through lignotubers. Very often, of course, the story of the Mediterranean is very much human abuse, felling of forests, fires. Very often the whole succession process gets cut short and we go back to square one again. And this, in a way, is the sort of curse of the Mediterranean region, that the succession never finishes. Where I am in Portugal, if you're lucky, you've got pine forest. There's not much, there's very, very little oak, and many, many hillsides covered in early succession brooms, which of course are incredibly flammable, which means that you then get locked into a cycle of endlessly repeating those early stages of succession. In other regions, this continual cycle might be pine, and this, of course, is the great environmental management problem of the Mediterranean region. How you can complete the succession cycle through to oak without being stuck in these early phases, which are dominated by early succession plants and indeed are particularly fire prone. Some of these succession stages can be very attractive and very biodiverse. Dehesha in Spanish, Montado in Portuguese, either cork oak or Quercus ilex, Quercus rotundifolia, with a fairly rich understory. Very often, however, the flora that we like are these kind of mid-succession stages with lots of cistus and lavender, fantastic biodiversity. And in design terms, this variation in height and texture, I think, is particularly attractive and makes this, I think, a useful model for designed landscapes. These variations in height we find interesting, attractive, and inevitably add real character to somewhere. However, the disadvantage, of course, is the flowering season is relatively short. This, of course, is on limestone. It does seem, however, as if the vast majority of these limestone lovers will grow perfectly well in garden situations on neutral or acidic soils. So it's not as if they have to have a calcareous soil. Many of them indeed are usable on other soils, which is a great relief to those of us who don't live on limestone. So moving on to some contemporary responses to rethinking the Mediterranean garden, getting away from all those straight lines of clipped evergreens. Miguel Ojijo in Spain makes great use of clipped forms, but in a much more informal way, which kind of subtly stylize the local flora. Here we've got Filaria and Lavandula clipped in a way that this is in a Dehesha landscape. If you look across, you have this vast landscape of a rounded Quercus ilex, like a sort of Quercus ilex savanna, and so these rounded forms echo that. A very early garden that Miguel made was up in the Sierra de Guadarrama, north of Madrid, quite high altitude, quite a small garden. And the use of Erica carnea here is very much reflects the clipping by wind and by goats. Up in the mountains, you very often see evergreen shrubs just like this, because that's how they're formed by the conditions, by continual grazing and wind exposure. And so this garden here, it's a sort of, in a way, it's quite, in one level, it's almost kind of Nordic, because it's got the birch trees, and it is actually very high up. Quite Japanese in a way. This reminds me of sort of Japanese coastal scenery, the way you see wind-clipped shrubs on cliff tops. Other gardens that Miguel is making rely very much on management, allowing shrubs to mesh together and not be continually cut as baubles, which I think is possibly one of the management issues that you do get in these gardens, that having a situation where these shrubs are allowed to take the form that the designer wants them to take. And Miguel's intention here is very much that all of these individual plants form a continuity, as in the last picture, rather than maintain themselves as individual plants. Fernando Matos, also Madrid-based, as a younger designer who is more plant-focused. Miguel doesn't use a huge variety of plants. Fernando is quite a sort of plant nerd, and is always seeking to broaden the range of plants he uses. He's very good at using grasses. Grasses, of course, making a wonderful contrast to those hummocky subshrub forms. Here we've got Stipa gigantea alternating with various clipped evergreens. Stipa gigantea is one of the kind of iconic plants almost of the kind of more steppe regions in the Mediterranean, colder winter regions of Portugal and Spain. A really fantastic native grass that often forms really impressive stands in nature, and a really kind of obvious thing to use in the garden. And one of his more adventurous projects, a wedding venue outside Madrid, where he's able to use a very large range of Mediterranean plants, of course, looking best in spring and early summer, with a wide variety of form and texture through the rest of the year. Olivier Filippi, of course, is the man of the moment. He and his wife Carla have spent a huge amount of time traversing the entire Mediterranean region, studying plants, collecting plants. There's a vast number in his display garden near Montpellier in southern France, and I think the nursery has something like 2,000 lines. Truly incredible plant collection, and a terrific consciousness raiser on what we can do in the Mediterranean region. And I think his approach to looking at a wide range of possibilities for ground cover, from very low ground cover to much higher ground cover, is particularly interesting strategy of plant selection. He's also, of course, a very thorough documenter of plants. One of the most valuable documentations he's doing is looking at this whole gradient of longevity and identifying those species or those genera where some level of harder pruning is possible, and therefore greater regeneration possibilities, greater possibilities of regeneration, and greater longevity are possible. In the winter, it's almost just as good. That the gradations in silver to green, the plant forms create a very, very attractive garden. The style is very much that low, hummocky. A lot of these get a light summer trim, so it's that still using the clipping to still echoing that kind of the look of plants in very exposed environments, or goat grazed, or whatever. I mean, imagine this without cypresses. It would perhaps be a little bit dull, but the cypresses add that essential spark. Well, it's pronounced in Spanish, not Portuguese. Alejandro O'Neill is a Uruguayan gardener who's working in around the Nice area in France, designing and managing gardens. He has a whole team of gardeners who very much work in a particular mode of very light, careful pruning, and his look is quite distinctly different to the Olivier Filippi look. It's much more raggedy. He very much points out that Filippi does not use many grasses. He likes very much to go for these quite kind of attenuated, raggedy shapes, sometimes entirely natural, at other times the results of very careful, selective pruning. So the overall effect is very much lighter. A lot of really nice seed heads as well. And a terrific plant range. Actually, probably most of these are from the Filippi nursery, but just to show that there's a whole gradient of possibilities around form and texture both in our plant selection, but also what we do with those plants once we've got them. And this garden is one of the ones we're going to be featured in the book that I'm doing with Claire. Now here, for example, we have a number of species that are clearly kept clipped. Those path edging forms kept nice and neat, but a much kind of wilder look behind. Elsewhere, an interesting project, Secalves, an art gallery in Porto in northern Portugal, plays with these forms again, perhaps with a much simpler palette, mostly ericas with suppressus. And this rather spectacular border, which was originally laid out in the 1930s as part of an Art Deco garden and revamped in the 1990s, I believe. Spectacular sort of shrub border, a wide variety of evergreen shrubs showing what can be done at scale with dry summer climate species. The weak point here being that a fair number of these are actually, like the Westringia I showed you earlier, species that plants that will continually grow outwards without any possibility of regenerative pruning. So at some point, there's going to have to be a big cutting back here and replanting. Leaving Europe, going to the United States. Sean Hogan in Oregon is a nurseryman, designer, fanatical plantaholic, a man with incredible knowledge of plants generally, but of the flora of the Western Cordilleras of the Americas in particular. The Oregonian flora and Northern Californian flora is a very rich one. I kind of suspect that a lot of these components are somehow longer lived, not so many short-lived subshrubs, perhaps, as in the Mediterranean region. And he's able to get these wonderful gradations in height and using shrubs very effectively to fill space in ways that is making the most of their foliage and texture. I love the way that no space is wasted here. That there's really good and really interesting and varied underplanting. And some of the key species here are the various species of Arctostaphylos, the madrones, which are a real iconic part of the flora of the Pacific Northwest, and of course, infamously, will die as soon as you turn the hose on them in summer. So gardens like this are very, very strictly no summer irrigation. And much of the planting is aimed to show off the attractive foliage barks of some of the madrones. Ceanothus, of course, native to the region. Nice mix of grasses, mostly cespitous grasses, bunch grasses. More shady areas, we segue into sort of darker green evergreens and ferns, although indeed many of these ferns are also quite drought tolerant. But a vegetation that's dense, very carefully chosen, and I think does a wonderful job of really stylizing, taking the best out of what the local flora can offer. Nearly all of these are natives of the Pacific Northwest. And on thinner soil areas, such as on this green roof, going over to much shallower substrate, shorter growing, more herbaceous species and grasses. And grasses, of course, these bunch grasses, very typical of dry summer climates. Very, very attractive plants, arguably terrifically underused. Mediterranean climates, of course, segue into steppe climates, particularly in the Eastern Mediterranean and in higher altitude regions of Spain. So a brief visit to a roundabout in the eastern part of Berlin. The subshrub count disappears to almost zero in the steppe. Instead, we have a very rich grass and perennial flora, a lot of which will also be successful in any Mediterranean climate. And for those of you who are in this kind of transitional steppe Mediterranean climate, which perhaps rules out some of the classic Mediterranean plants, there is a terrific range of plants that can be used. And I think a growing awareness of the value of these steppe floras. And of course, yuccas. There's a good number of yucca species from North America that are from steppe or indeed cold desert habitats and that will thrive, if you've got to have your kind of exotic looking spikies. So there we are. I've tried to outline, I'm a very beginner gardener in this region, but I hope that's been useful in terms of a sort of illustration of my unpacking the sources of knowledge and inspiration I've been looking at over the last few years. I haven't included any pictures of my own Portuguese garden, which is still in very early stages, although we're doing pretty well. And at some future stage, I do hope I'll be able to do a presentation to you about that, because it's really very exciting indeed. The sense of pioneering, that there's so many plants that can be grown here, and yet the range of plants available locally is so limited. Just the possibilities are enormous. Mm-hmm. So to end, I will just flag up Garden Masterclass, which is a business I set up a couple of years ago with the British garden designer Annie Guilfoyle to run live workshops. Come COVID, we went to do webinars, and we have a rich and varied webinar program through the year. We do make quite an effort to do events with presenters, tutors from dry summer climates. We had Panayoti Kalaides a while ago talking about steppe. Though nearly all of those webinars are available as recordings, which can be downloaded for a modest fee. Every Thursday evening at 6 o'clock London time, we do a pro bono event, which we started doing during lockdown when we were doing we did this 5 days a week. So this is our public service broadcast where we interview somebody, an interesting garden or landscape person. We have a membership scheme, and we are going to be moving into films, garden tours, and very much more. We are very much the new digital face of garden media and operating very much on a global basis. So hopefully you will come and join us at some time.
Thank you, Noel. I'm sure that we will. In fact, your Garden Masterclass was the inspiration for my small efforts at getting us together on Zoom. I found this to be a very interesting approach, a slightly more intellectual perhaps, but very, very, very interesting. I'd like to ask my colleague Yvonne Barton if she would then come with any questions that have pitched up on the chat. So we can start with those, and then when we've done with those, perhaps if anybody would like to, speak directly to Noel, we'll do that after. Yvonne?
Yeah. No, could I just say that your talk has got everybody thinking, and quite a few people have written in with general remarks about, firstly, climate. When do we get rain here? And I think it does vary where you are in the Mediterranean. It's not uniform. And secondly, fire risk, and this is a real fear and headache right across the whole Mediterranean band of climates in America and Australia, as well as here in the Mediterranean. So could I just first of all just say that first of all, we all need to know our own rainfall patterns, and one Annemiek did note that we're not getting as much spring rain anymore. We tend to get autumn and winter rains here at the moment. We're seeing a shift in rain patterns. So it means that our dry period is getting longer and longer. This year here in Italy, we had no rain at all from the beginning of April right through until nearly September. And that's bad, even though we had a wet winter. So this means that fire risk is even more important to us now. And would you like to, for example, grasses? You mentioned grasses as a very nice way of giving a lift to a garden design, but are they not very inflammable?
Yeah, I mean, the fire risk thing is one that we're going to have to address more and more. I mean, it would be certainly, I know some American states have started to do, and presumably probably USDA extension services have started to do trials on fire risk and actually then posting online categories of plants according to their fire risk. Of course, the biggest fire risk of all are trees. I mean, eucalyptus is the obvious thing. Eucalyptus, of course, is the curse of Portugal, and I hope to God other Mediterranean countries don't plant any more of this wretched plant. Pine, of course, is also pretty bad. Once we come down to the shrub level, the amount of biomass to burn, inevitably is very much reduced. Having areas around the house free of inflammable vegetation, obviously, of course, important, and of course also perhaps chimes in if we are if we are going to take the approach that we perhaps will irrigate only small high visibility areas. It makes sense to have these around the house and to have our sort of native, more flammable, drought tolerant planting further back. I mean, I think what would be most useful would be fire tests on plants. So sort of rough guide, anything with very fine hairs, like phlomis, for example, is particularly dangerous. Anything with aromatic oils, anything where there's a very high ratio of very high ratio of kind of air to plant, like brooms or another. Basically, the kind of more the larger the foliage, or the more like a sort of conventional evergreen, the less fire risk there seems to be. Box doesn't seem to burn at all. I have some friends up the road who were hit by the fires of October 7, 2017, their box was their whole property was just, as if everybody in this region was just had this rain of well, actually more like an air blast of cinders, and anything that would burnt. And their Italian cypresses were nearly all okay. And indeed, Olivier Filippi indeed claims that their foliage is so dense they don't burn. And their box was absolutely fine. And the phlomis went up like nobody's business. Grasses, it all depends with grasses if they're evergreen. And the Stipa gigantea, for example, is evergreen, and I hardly imagine that would burn. Light grasses don't actually flare up dramatically, but don't burn for very long. The ones that are dangerous are, well, miscanthus. I used to burn my grasses in England as a way of just dealing with them rather than compost. It was quite good fun. You set light to the base of a calamagrostis Carl Thurston. You get about 10 seconds of kind of spectacular flame, but over very, very quickly. Miscanthus, if you try to burn miscanthus, will go off like a bomb. And the most dangerous of all are restios. Anyone who grows restios should be deported immediately. There's an interesting theory that in the extraordinary South African Cape flora, the restios evolved first and were so flammable that their flammability then dictated the entire course of evolution in the South African Cape, and all the proteas and ericas and all the rest of that extraordinarily rich flora are actually a response to frequent fires facilitated by restios.
Interesting. Just to follow up, there's been lots of comments coming in whilst you were talking. Cheryl in California mentions a plant nursery called La Pilitas, which specializes in native plants and has some very interesting research on which natives burn more.
Oh gosh, that sounds interesting. Yes.
So that's on the chat. So anybody who's interested, there's a link on the chat. Annemiek mentions, of course, that you can in permaculture avoid fire risk, but in particular, she makes sure that there are water sources all around the garden, which are so that you can tackle the fire if necessary. I have to say, we had a fire here, not my fault, the next door neighbour, and I rather regretted that I didn't have any water available at that particular point on the property. One or two people are also very interested, Noel, in hearing about your first impressions of coming to garden in Portugal. And George Everett mentions that the Monserrate Palace and Garden in Sintra were managed by a Kingsbury. Are you a member of the same family?
I very much doubt it. That's odd, that, because I did have a look around Montserrat with the guy whose name I'm afraid I cannot remember, who did restore it, an English chap, Gerald Luckhurst, and he didn't mention that, and I would have thought he would have done. I'll look into that. No, I didn't think so. Yes, yeah, very interesting indeed about this nursery in California. Yeah, first impressions of Portuguese gardening. Well, Portuguese gardens, the traditional gardens, are very formulaic. I mean, these tight little compositions of clipped box, basically, rather charming, but very, very formulaic. Popular gardening is very sort of pot based, very good. I mean, it's a lot of pelargoniums and orchids, and there's a sort of fairly high standard of traditional horticulture. Very, very few interesting contemporary gardens, though, although I think that is changing, and there's a real increase in growth in interest in gardens here. We have a very interesting developing contemporary garden up the road, created by twin brothers, one of whom is a well-known Portuguese writer. And there's the Santar Garden Village, which is a very interesting project involving the landscaping of an entire village by Fernando Coruncho. And a number of other things developing. So, a country to keep your eyes on, I think.
Mm-hmm. Could you just please, sorry, before we leave you this Q&A, Annemiek asking, when you say restios, what exactly do you mean?
Restios, it's a sort of generic term for South African, I think they're Juncaceae, they're rush relatives. It's a group of South African plants scattered amongst various genera, the names of which are none of which I can remember because I've never grown any of them. And in Portugal, I have no desire to. They're always called Restionaceae, that's it. I think it's closely allied to rushes. Thank you for that, Cheryl. Restionaceae, yeah. So avoid them like the plague.
Okay, now, and just to mention that Kirsten Honeyman in California mentions that Rana Creek Native Plant Nursery in the Carmel Valley is somewhere that our American colleagues would be interested in. And Cheryl's actually written the name down, Restionaceae.
Yeah,
so
right,
we've got and just to ask also, you mentioned box. Here in Italy, we have box blight and box moth. Have you not got these in Portugal yet?
Yes. I think it depends. Yeah, I mean, I think they're everywhere, and I see now that you can get a pheromone trap for the caterpillars, which are probably the most destructive one of the lot. I mean, if you have box and you really, do probably a twice weekly inspection and have a power pressure washer to sort of blast them with. If anything nasty appears, I think that really is the only way. I mean, it's a tragedy. I think possibly a tragedy for wild populations as well, for box, which is an extraordinarily irreplaceable plant. There's nothing else that does the job that box does.
I'm using Myrcene africanus.
Oh yes, yeah.
But I mean, it's slow, but it appears to be. It's quite good. I mean, it looks similar and doesn't is as yet not subject to the
yeah.
Okay, I think we've covered most of the chat. So and Karen saying that she uses myrtle as well.
Myrtle, yes. Now myrtle's great, but it doesn't have the kind of strength of box somehow, and box has that wonderful ability just to kind of fill up with new leaves if necessary.
Okay, so anybody live would like to ask a direct question vocally? I mean, I wanted to say something, if I may, about the garden in Menorca that Piet Udolf.
Oh, yes.
So is this going to Harold, you know, is his style changing, or?
I think inevitably I should be very interested to see what it's like. I mean, he's designed a very small garden in Tel Aviv before and a small garden in Barcelona, but this is the first kind of really extensive garden I think he's done in the Mediterranean region. And he was talking to obviously Felipe and a number of other people in France, and he's getting a lot of his plants from, I think, Sala Grupera, that really good wholesale nursery in Barcelona. So I should be very interested to see how it shapes up. Inevitably, there will be quite a change, but I mean, his emphasis is always on plant structure, and I think he'll have plenty of good stuff to play with.
Okay. Any other questions?
I just want to thank Noel for a very interesting presentation, especially on the woody growth, where you can expect no coming back
Generation,
because that's really something I never heard before. So
it's absolutely fundamental to understanding all shrubs, but particularly in the Mediterranean.
Because nobody has said that on Rosmarino.
Yeah, no, I'm surprised how these very fundamental questions of plant growth just again and again just don't seem to get addressed. I think it's very important that I call it the rabbit's eye view, getting down on hands and knees and seeing what's going on at ground level. You know, you learn a lot about plants that way, and it's sort of making these kind of observations is important.
Because I think you always feel slightly guilty, you know, why is this now looking like this? You know, it's gone. And you think that you've done everything in terms of pruning correctly to try and encourage it not to happen, but it happens.
Yes.
There's a reason.
Start again from seedlings at the or cuttings. You know, these are inevitably short cycle plants.
Or let it grow, and then you have a kind of tree-like structure, and you can like it and underplant it.
That's right. Yes, that's a possibility. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, really, great many thanks, Noel. Really
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I think we will be joining you in your own online endeavors, which are certainly, you know, fantastic. And this has been a very, very productive and useful talk for us all. So I'm sure we all join you in. And the Lemon Tree Trust will be very happy to have received a contribution. Thank you, everybody, for joining.
Great. Okay, all the best. Bye, everybody. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Take care.